At 11:26 a.m. on February 3, 1943, over the Bay of Biscay, a lone U.S. Navy PBY Catalina radioed that it was still airborne after sustaining direct hits from German fighters. That transmission should not have existed. The Catalina was a slow, lightly armed patrol aircraft operating far from fighter cover. Its mission, anti-submarine reconnaissance, placed it at low altitude over open water, where escape options were limited and interception was often fatal. German long-range fighters patrolling the bay routinely destroyed such aircraft within minutes once contact was made. During this engagement, the Catalina was attacked repeatedly. Cannon fire tore through the fuselage. Fuel tanks were punctured. Control cables were damaged. One engine lost power. The aircraft caught fire briefly before the flames were beaten down by airflow and emergency action. According to operational expectations, a flying boat in that condition was not expected to survive. Loss of an engine at low altitude reduced speed below safe margins. Structural damage threatened breakup in turbulence. Fire in flight usually ended the mission immediately. Yet the Catalina did not ditch. Instead, it maintained altitude just long enough to turn west, away from occupied France, and began a slow retreat toward Allied-controlled waters. For more than an hour, it remained airborne, exposed, damaged, and alone. When the aircraft finally landed at a coastal base in England, it did so with wounded crewmen still aboard and its airframe compromised beyond repair. The mission was recorded as incomplete. The aircraft was written off. The fact that it returned at all was treated as an anomaly. From a distance, the survival of the Catalina appears improbable but incidental. From inside the aircraft, it depended on whether a slow, damaged machine could be kept within a narrow band of flight long enough to reach safety, after every system designed to protect it had already failed. This is not a story about air combat tactics or dramatic dogfights. It is a story about endurance under exposure and how survival in the air can become a problem of restraint rather than resistance. The Bay of Biscay in early 1943 was one of the most dangerous operating environments for Allied patrol aircraft. German U-boats used the area as a transit corridor, and German air units maintained regular patrols to protect them. Allied aircraft flew long missions at low altitude, scanning for submarines while remaining vulnerable to interception. The PBY Catalina was designed for range and endurance, not speed. Cruising at low altitude conserved fuel and improved visibility, but placed the aircraft within reach of enemy fighters operating from coastal airfields. Once detected, a Catalina could not outrun pursuit. Survival depended on early warning or concealment, neither of which was available that morning. Weather conditions were marginal. Low cloud cover reduced visibility above the aircraft, but offered limited concealment below. Sea state was rough, making emergency ditching hazardous even under ideal circumstances. Wind shear near the surface introduced instability for an aircraft already compromised by damage. The attack occurred far from friendly shipping or air cover. Radio contact was intermittent. The Catalina's defensive armament was limited and intended only to discourage, not defeat, attackers. Once engaged, the aircraft's options narrowed rapidly. After the first attack pass, the Catalina lost formation speed entirely. One engine produced reduced power. Control response became sluggish. The aircraft's ability to climb was effectively gone. The environment offered no safe alternative. Ditching risked capsizing or enemy capture. Continuing forward meant flying a damaged aircraft through contested airspace with no expectation of assistance. The setting transformed the problem from tactical evasion into mechanical survival. The question was no longer how to escape the enemy, but whether the aircraft could be kept flying at all. The aircraft commander was Lieutenant J.G. William H. Carter, 30 years old, a naval aviator with prior experience flying patrol aircraft in poor weather rather than combat-heavy zones. Before the war, he flew commercial seaplanes along the Gulf Coast, where navigation errors and mechanical issues were routine hazards rather than exceptions. That background shaped his approach to risk. He did not expect systems to function perfectly. He expected gradual failure and believed survival depended on recognizing when an aircraft's behavior changed. The co-pilot, Ensign Robert Myers, was newly qualified but trained as an engineer before entering flight school. He understood the Catalina's systems at a practical level and focused on trends rather than instrument readings alone. The flight engineer and radio man worked closely, relaying damage reports and managing power distribution manually as electrical systems failed intermittently. Gunners tended to wounded crewmen while remaining at their stations, aware that another attack could come at any moment. No one on board discussed combat victory or mission success once the aircraft was hit. Their focus narrowed to basic questions: which engine still responded, which controls remained reliable, and how much stress the airframe could tolerate. Carter did not attempt aggressive maneuver. He reduced power demands, leveled the aircraft, and accepted a gradual loss of altitude in exchange for stability. Every action was measured against a single criterion. Did it keep the Catalina flying longer? Those habits, formed long before the Bay of Biscay, would determine whether the aircraft remained airborne long enough to reach friendly waters, or became another loss recorded without explanation. U.S. Navy patrol aviation doctrine in 1943 was built around avoidance rather than confrontation. Aircraft like the PBY Catalina were never intended to survive sustained fighter engagement. Their protection came from distance, early detection, and the assumption that enemy interception could be avoided through timing and routing. The system assumed three things: that patrol aircraft would spot enemy fighters first, that radio contact could summon assistance or redirect course, and that damage, if it occurred, would be limited enough to allow either escape or controlled ditching. Over the Bay of Biscay, all three assumptions failed. German fighters appeared without warning, emerging from cloud cover at altitude. Radio transmission was delayed by interference and distance. The first attack pass caused multiple system failures at once: fuel leaks, control cable damage, and engine degradation, leaving no clean emergency procedure to follow. Doctrine offered clear guidance for isolated failures. It did not address layered damage sustained under continuous threat. Checklists assumed time. Time did not exist. The Catalina's defensive armament was symbolic rather than decisive. Gunners could discourage a straight approach, but could not prevent repeated passes. Escort fighters were not assigned to routine patrols this far offshore. Once engaged, the aircraft was alone. The system that was supposed to keep the Catalina safe had not been poorly designed. It had been optimized for a different problem. When the aircraft was forced into a role it was never meant to perform, surviving fighter attack, the system offered no solution. What remained was an airframe still producing lift, an engine still turning, and a crew forced to decide how much more failure could be tolerated before the aircraft ceased to exist as a machine. The decisive moment came after the second attack pass, when the German fighters disengaged briefly to reposition. Lieutenant Carter understood what that pause meant. It was not mercy. It was preparation for another, likely final, attack. At that point, he faced two options. The first was to ditch immediately. The aircraft was still controllable enough to attempt a water landing. Doctrine supported that decision. Survival odds in rough seas were uncertain, but capture or death might still be avoided. The second option was to remain airborne and attempt withdrawal toward Allied airspace. Doing so meant flying a damaged aircraft with reduced power, leaking fuel, and compromised control surfaces, knowing that another interception could occur at any moment. Carter chose to stay airborne. The decision was not framed as confidence in the aircraft. It was framed as assessment of alternatives. The Catalina was still flying. The crew was still functional. A controlled ditching under enemy threat carried its own lethal risks. Once the decision was made, the aircraft's purpose shifted completely. The mission was abandoned. Navigation was simplified to a general westerly heading. Altitude was traded deliberately for engine stability and control response. The Catalina would not try to outrun the enemy. It would try to outlast exposure. Survival depended on minimizing stress rather than restoring performance. Carter reduced engine power to levels that balanced vibration and thrust. The damaged engine was throttled back to prevent seizure, even though doing so reduced airspeed below nominal safety margins. Symmetry mattered more than speed. Control inputs were softened. Large corrections were avoided entirely. The aircraft was allowed to drift slightly rather than be forced back to perfect alignment. Trim adjustments replaced direct control where possible. Inside the fuselage, weight was redistributed. Non-essential equipment was jettisoned to reduce load and lower stall speed. Crew movement was restricted to prevent sudden shifts in balance. Fuel management became critical. Leaking tanks were isolated when possible. Consumption was recalculated repeatedly as estimates changed. Range was uncertain, but predictability was preserved. Navigation relied on basic cues, sun position, compass heading, and coastline estimates, rather than precise plotting. Each turn was planned minutes in advance and executed gradually to avoid structural stress. Fatigue mounted steadily. Concentration could not lapse. Every vibration change, every sound shift was evaluated. The aircraft remained flyable only because it was being asked to do less with each passing minute. By the time the Catalina cleared the most dangerous stretch of airspace, it was no longer operating as designed. It was being kept airborne through restraint, compromise, and the acceptance that survival meant flying within failure, not against it. The cost of remaining airborne became evident as the Catalina pushed westward, minute by minute. Damage that had been survivable in the short term grew progressively more dangerous as time passed. Fuel leakage worsened as vibration loosened already compromised fittings. The smell of aviation fuel remained constant in the cabin, forcing the crew to keep ventilation open despite cold air and spray entering through damaged sections of the hull. Every change in airflow altered the aircraft's handling slightly, requiring continual correction. The damaged engine deteriorated steadily. Oil pressure fluctuated. Temperature crept upward in small but unmistakable increments. The engineer throttled back repeatedly, accepting further loss of speed to prevent total seizure. Each adjustment reduced the margin against stall. Crew fatigue became a limiting factor. Maintaining degraded flight demanded constant physical effort and concentration. Hands cramped on controls. Eyes strained to interpret unreliable instruments. Communication grew shorter and more functional as energy was conserved. Wounded crewmen weakened as the flight continued. Bleeding reopened under vibration. Pain increased as shock wore off. There was little that could be done beyond keeping them conscious and warm. Medical treatment was secondary to keeping the aircraft stable. Psychological pressure mounted quietly. There was no dramatic escalation, only the sustained awareness that any new failure would be unrecoverable. The crew stopped discussing distance or time. Attention narrowed to immediate cues: engine sound, control resistance, airflow noise. By the time the English coastline came into view, the aircraft was no longer being flown in the conventional sense. It was being balanced, kept within a shrinking envelope where lift, thrust, and control still overlapped. The Catalina reached a coastal base in southern England late in the afternoon. Carter executed a cautious water landing just offshore, avoiding any maneuver that required aggressive control input. The aircraft settled heavily but remained upright. Rescue boats reached the aircraft within minutes. The crew was evacuated before worsening fuel leaks created additional danger. Medical teams treated the wounded. Engineers inspected the airframe and quickly confirmed that the aircraft was beyond economical repair. In official records, the mission was listed as incomplete. The aircraft was written off. Damage was attributed to enemy action during patrol. No extended analysis followed. Patrol aviation doctrine did not change. The Catalina's survival was categorized as exceptional but non-instructive. The system absorbed the outcome without revising assumptions about survivability under fighter attack. Informally, however, the experience circulated. Pilots discussed restraint over aggression. Engineers talked about flying inside failure rather than fighting it. These lessons traveled through conversation rather than manuals. The war moved on. Aircraft were replaced. Losses continued elsewhere. The Catalina was dismantled quietly, its final flight reduced to log entries and a brief after-action note. There is no marker along the Bay of Biscay that records how narrowly it avoided becoming another loss at sea. What remains is the understanding that survival did not come from speed, firepower, or bold maneuver. It came from recognizing limits early and respecting them consistently, accepting that restraint, not resistance, was the only viable path left. If carefully researched, grounded war stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing to the channel to support our team and help ensure these histories continue to be told.